Jungkook pulled air through his teeth at your words, resulting in a sharp hissing sound, and then he stepped back and pulled his hand from your fingers. Don't call me that, he said quietly, only to realize how harsh it must have sounded and therefore adding, please. You ripped yourself out of it and quickly took a step back too, bringing some distance between you and him. Sorry, he mumbled, and his face softened a little. It's okay, he said. His voice was a bit rough, desperate for something to do to interrupt the tension building between you and the demon. He reached for the glass on the counter and chugged the water. You want some too? You asked, while turning around for a refill, all the while forgetting that the demon didn't eat nor drink. Jungkook's quiet laughter made you realize your mistake and you sighed in playful exaggeration while turning on the tab and checking the water temperature with a finger. Nobody likes to drink lukewarm water after all. I'm a mess, you mumbled to yourself while filling the glass, and Jungkook leaned against the kitchen island with a thud. He was seemingly more relaxed now that the inevitably uncomfortable part of your encounter was over. Don't worry about it, he replied in an easygoing manner. I appreciate the offer even if I can't take it. When you turned around again, he shot you a playful wink and you relaxed. Still, you shrugged, taking another big sip. Sometimes I feel like I don't want to offend you guys. Jungkook shook his head. I told you not to worry about it. He repeated himself. Rest assured, we won't get offended, though. The corners of his mouth twitched and you couldn't tell if it was because of a smile or a growl. I can't speak for all of us. Speaking of which, you said after a short pause during which you debated whether you should comment on Jungkook's implied criticism of Namjoon. What is this picture? You turned around to the cupboard and pointed at it with the glass in your hand. Where is it from? Jungkook's expression flickered somewhere between anger and sadness, and his eyes darkened a bit. He pushed himself off the kitchen island and stepped up onto you, stopping right by your side and crossing his arms in front of his chest. His eyes narrowed the tiniest bit and he seemed kind of defensive. That was a gift, if you will. He mumbled. Whether he was lost in thoughts or memories, he couldn't tell, but his glance was glued to the photograph. A gift? You couldn't hide your curiosity. From whom? The men who caught us. A voice rang out to both of you and you quickly turned around while Jungkook stood completely unimpressed. Hoseok was standing in the door, red eyes flickering back and forth between you and the younger demon before he sighed and approached you. That, he said, eyes resting on the yellowed picture, is just shortly before we entered this earth hole forever. Walking by, he stroked past Jungkook's side, and which could have almost seemed accidental if it wasn't for his hand, which rested on the devil's back for a second too long to be a coincidence. With a quick hand movement, he plugged the photo from the cupboard, threw a short lens at it, and then handed it to you for further inspection. It was taken by one of the men as a reminder of their triumph over the Seven Sense. He clicked his tongue and now seemed almost angry. I don't know if it was meant as a joke at our expense, but they gave us a second one. I didn't know Jin kept it. You stared at the picture for a while, then gave it back to Hoseok, who carefully reattached it to the cupboard. After a while of silence, you turned to Jungkook. You look younger in the picture, he commented softly. Almost human? Hoseok finished his sentence with a short look towards the other when you didn't dare to say it. Yeah, he does. He was. Almost. He frowned, but Jungkook made no attempt to speak up. Instead, he seemed frozen in his spot and couldn't take his eyes off the picture. His expression was something you had never seen before, neither on humans nor on the demons, and thus indescribable. A flicker of different feelings within mere seconds, melting together into something that you weren't sure any human was capable of feeling. Hoseok's glance, however, turned soft. He seemed to understand too well what Jungkook felt. You go, he mumbled, causing Jungkook to flinch out of his haze. I'll explain. Jungkook threw you a short, almost apologetic glance before storming out of the room. You followed his movements with your glance, then turned to Hoseok in confusion. His eyes still rested on the door where Jungkook had already vanished. It's better to not mention this before him, he finally said, and to return your glance. But he didn't seem angry at all. Just so you know, he said. Hoseok led you to the dinner room, the place where the two of you had first met. You set your glass of water down on the dark wooden table and took a seat. Hoseok sat down right next to you. I don't know if you remember, he began, frowning. A human's memory is so short-lived. But the first time I talked to you here at this table, I asked you if you knew how demons were made, and you said no. He cocked his head to the side slightly. You remember? You nodded. The memory was vague, but he remembered the overall occurrence. That time when he threw the apple at the wall? You asked, and Hoseok seemed as if he had to bite back a smile. Exactly, he hummed. Jin had to clean it up afterwards. He was not amused. I had to run for my life. He quacked an eyebrow in disbelief. You? Really? You asked, but Hoseok replied with nothing but a weak smile. Now, I never gave you an answer to that, I think. Would you like to know, Mia? His red eyes now rested on your face with a firm, serious glance. Do you want to know the full story of the seven sins? You hesitated only a little, but Hoseok's hard glance didn't waver or move away from your face. He seemed to know you would agree before you yourself knew it, and when you finally uttered a quiet yes, his expression turned almost content. Fine, he said, as if it took a lot of convincing for him to spill the story, and leaned back a bit. Ultimately, he reminded you of your grandfather. You used to take on a position similar to Hoseok's whenever he told stories to your 4-year-old self, or prepared for a rant about war and the deterioration of the military. The thought made you chuckle, but even though Hoseok noticed, he overlooked it. Basics, he started off. How are demons made? It was a rhetorical question, but you still shrugged. Neither did you know, nor did you ever have thought about it. At least not since your first conversation with the demon in front of you. Hoseok frowned, gathering his thoughts before answering his own question. Demons, apart from the lower species and the top class, don't just ascend from hell or wander out of a dark forest. The thought alone that the folklores and the whispers of the people could be true seemed to amuse me. We don't just come from anywhere, and contrary to popular belief, we aren't made out of darkness. And now his lips twitched in despise. Supernatural things. He seemed to have lost his train of thoughts for a moment, but you knew better than to interrupt him. Instead, you patiently waited until he spoke up again. Demons were beings before they were turned into what they are now. Some were cats, see Diamond? Some were bats. See the lava devils that Jimin showed you? And some were humans. He made a hand movement which included the whole house, or rather, the demons that lived in it. Before we were the seven sins, we were humans. And some of us, Jin or Yoongi, were even normal demons before that. It's a complex transformation, but we can start at the beginning if you want. You simply nodded again, and Hoseok seemed fine with it. He leaned back a bit further and stared up to the ceiling of the room. We have been here nearly 247 years, he mumbled, seemingly more to himself than to you. That is a long time for a human, for a demon, it is. He snapped his fingers like a blink of an eye. How old are you? Your question caused Hoseok to lower his head and look at you again. You're asking me how old I am? Rude. He chuckled, but the spark in his eyes gave away that he didn't really mean it. Even so, he had to think shortly, and that alone, having to calculate and to take a moment before telling someone your age. Not because you forgot for a second, but because you're literally too old to keep count. Reminded you of the giant difference between you and the devils once again. I am 12.784 years old. He finally decided, eyes narrowing as he went over it once more, then nodded. 12.784. Your brain tried to wrap itself around the fact that this man had lived through nearly 13 millennia, but failed miserably. Yet you were curious. How about the others? You inquired, and Jose was willing to reply after another short calculation. Jen must be about 19.000 years old now, he began, and even his voice sounded a bit strained at this. I've lost count of his age. Yoongi is a bit younger, 17.473 if I remember right. He turned 473 just 2 months ago. 473. Ozek felt interrupted in his calculations and threw you a sharp glance, then sighed. Whatever. You thought you heard him mumble to himself, then he proceeded to answer your unspoken question. It's too much of a bother to count the millennia, so we go by the hundreds until a new millennia is reached. You nodded and he continued. You know my age already. Next is Namjoon. He's barely a mere 1,000 years younger than me. Must be about 11.619. He shrugged. Jimin is 10.851 and Taeyong 9407 years old. Now his eyes darkened and he paused a bit. But Jungkook. He seemed to take a deep breath as if he was hesitant about saying it, but then sighed. Jungkook is a mere 2100 years old. He is the youngest by far and he struggles the most with what happened to him. He looked up, his choice of words making you curious. Happened to him? You inquired, and Hoseok shot you a short, dark glance. Even though he offered to explain to you, the topic still seemed to be an uncomfortable one for him. Mia? He now got your attention and leaned forward a bit, looking at you firmly, the dark bloody red in his eyes swirled with emotion. As I said, demons don't just crawl out of hell like in the stories. Silence weighed heavy on your shoulders for a moment as Hoseok paused. Then he leaned back into his chair again and sighed deeply. If someone or something becomes a demon, he mumbled, so quietly that you had to listen closely to understand him. It means means that something went wrong when their souls got consumed. He crossed his arms in front of his chest and looked up to the ceiling, the grey stones apparently catching his interest. He didn't raise his voice when he continued, and this time you had to physically lean forward to understand what he was saying. In other words, someone becomes a demon when a part of their soul is left over by accident or because it cannot be swallowed. It's a teeny tiny bit, not enough to make us anything close to a human, but it's enough to keep us alive, unlike normal shikas. You frowned. What? You asked, struggling to pronounce the unfamiliar word. What's that? Ozek's lips twitched. It's the demonic word for bite, used to refer to a soul that is meant to be consumed. A sacrifice, for example. His eyes rested on you and you lowered your head when you realized what he was hinting at. I am a Kshaya then? You murmured, and Hoseok nodded, but his expression was friendly. A unique one, he added. But before he could ask about that, he returned to his story. 6 of us were Kshiyas, whose consumption went wrong. However, one of us had a soul that couldn't be fully swallowed. But let's start at the beginning. He crossed his hands over his stomach, reminding you even more of your storytelling grandfather now. Now, how did Jin, the oldest, become a demon?